The NFL draft is 3 weeks away, a little less than that, less than 3 weeks away. And that means you've got less than 3 weeks to get your draft props right. Make sure you're feeling good about all of your picks. And that's what we're here to do. Welcome in to the Early Edge NFL Draft Prop Show presented by BetMGM. I'm Dave Richard, Fantasy Football Today on CBS Sports. You can call me Uncle Dave. I've been that nickname now for a few years. I like it. I think it's fun. If you missed last Friday's episode, you missed a lot of talk on quarterbacks and running backs, and we are doing nothing on quarterbacks and running backs on this episode. And not much has changed with those positions. So go back, won't you? Go see what we had to say about the quarterbacks and running backs. There were a couple of locks made last week, by the way. I think it's worth your time to go back and see. Of course, if you were already subscribed to SportsLine here on YouTube, you would have seen our locked in props already. But if you aren't, go ahead and rectify that situation right now. Help yourself. Follow our portfolio of videos. I'm using fancy words. My parents will be proud of me. Do it for free. Subscribe to SportsLine right now. That's it. You'll be notified of every show that we do. It'll help you out when it comes to making your picks in all sports. Did I mention that it's free? I think I did. Okay. Enough about all this. Let's take a look at the locks from last week. I'm being nice. There were 3 picks last week. There's more to come. One of them was mine, Trey Benson, first running back off the board. One of them was EC's. In fact, 2 of them were EC's, including a conflicting one with mine, first running back off the board. Of course, if you take both of them, you'll probably make a little bit of money. Let's bring on my compadres, my folks, my crew, the guys who are going to help us make some props and turn the NFL draft into a fun and profitable event. Eric Cohen, EC, and Alex Selznick, a.k.a. Propstarz. Enough of me yapping. Let's get to the analysis. Last week, we touched on Caleb Williams this much. This week, we're going to touch on Marvin Harrison this much. Well, yeah, we're talking wide receivers at the start, and there's a lot to get into. Does anyone think it's worth betting on another wide receiver anyway? It feels like Marvin Harrison is the consensus. Alex, am I crazy? Should we just move on? Or is Marvin Harrison just the consensus top wide receiver, the first guy that's going to go off the board?
I have to be honest with you, Dave. I like one wide receiver quite a bit more than Marvin Harrison. There might even be another wide receiver that I like almost as much as him as well. But I'm starting with Malik Nabers. I think Malik Nabers is a significantly better prospect than Marvin Harrison Jr. I also would suggest that if Marvin Harrison Jr.'s name wasn't Marvin Harrison Jr., that this would be a foregone conclusion that Malik Nabers would be drafted ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. I think, again, let me preface by stating I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a fine prospect. I have him as the second best wide receiver in this draft, so certainly I'm not suggesting he's going to be a bust or a slouch or anything of the sort, but I just have such a high opinion of Malik Nabers, fellas. I am betting him in a variety of ways. I'm betting him to be the first non-quarterback taken. I am betting him to be the first wide receiver off the board. I am betting him to potentially go 4th overall. If I look at Malik Nabers, I see one of the most explosive, fast twitch, just incredible acceleration, ability to separate prospects that I have seen. He reminds me a lot of Jamar Chase, reminds me a lot of Odell Beckham Jr., and even some Justin Jefferson. Oh, by the way, 3 former great LSU receivers. Malik Nabers, to me, is a once in an every 2 to 3 year type prospect at the wide receiver position. Marvin Harrison Jr., very polished, has a lot of nuance to his game, obviously the pedigree. But if we're looking for explosiveness, if we're looking for separation, there are few guys in the NFL currently that I think possess more than Malik Nabers. I came into this of the thought that, Harrison Jr. was the consensus pick. I assume that would be the case. Then after studying the film, I think you can make a very compelling argument that it's not just close, that Nabers is the superior prospect. I also would argue that multiple evaluators, scouts, decision makers have Nabers as the top wide receiver on their board. It is the media that has really decided that Harrison Jr. is that number 1 prospect. So I think there's at least or close to a 50% chance that Malik Nabers is taken above Marvin Harrison Jr., and I think we'll see a lot of teams eventually release that he was, in fact, the number one wide receiver on their respective draft boards.
All right, so Proppy, I know you're a genius, okay? You are so smart in everything you do, but I got to disagree with you here, and I'll tell you why. When you look at the quarterback play in college for Marvin Harrison, now I know he had C.J. Stroud a couple of years ago, but he had Kyle McCord last year, and Kyle McCord is now at Syracuse, had to transfer because, I mean, from Ohio State to Syracuse, that's a big downgrade. Malik Neighbors had the Heisman Trophy winner in Jaden Daniels, who very well could go number 2 overall to Washington or number 3 to New England or whomever else. You can watch last week's show to figure out more. I don't see how a team can pass on Harrison. Now, I'm not saying that Neighbors won't be a fine NFL prospect, but to me, I'm not going to bet Harrison at minus 700 to go as the first wide receiver off the board. You just can't do that. I just don't think a GM could put their reputation on the line, Dave, to pass on, Harrison for Neighbors. And that's why, now I will say this, with that said, I live out in Arizona and the Cardinals do dumb things. And I could see the Cardinals doing a stupid thing and trading the pick so a team can take a quarterback like a Minnesota, trades up to 4, and Arizona trades back. So therefore, I think the Chargers at 5 who desperately need a receiver. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr. and Justin Herbert is a dream combo. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is plus 300 to go 5th. That is the bet that I would make right now, that Arizona would trade the pick and Harrison goes 5th to the Chargers.
That's interesting. And I think Jim Harbaugh would go nuts if that happened. Did you know that Jim Harbaugh recruited Marvin Harrison Jr. heavily when he was a prospect? And you said it. Harrison wanted to follow McCord to Ohio State. They played together in high school. They wanted to play together in college. That's why he chose Ohio State ultimately. I think it worked out very well for Harrison, not so much for McCord. And Harbaugh can go and get his man now. But Harbaugh also recruited Neighbors. And so he knows these guys. He's played against Harrison. He knows what Harrison can do. I feel like all 3 of these wide receivers, it's like walking into an ice cream shop. You've got plenty of different flavors. It just depends on what type of a flavor you want. Proppy, I don't disagree with you at all. Nobody's got the speed, size, physicality combo that Malik Neighbors has in this draft. But I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to get open with his footwork, his savviness, the way that he uses his body as well. I think he's going to get open for the next decade in the NFL. I think he's a terrific prospect. He wins jump balls. He's got big size. He's got great hands. I think he fits Arizona a lot better than Malik Neighbors does. It's just by a little bit. And that's why I think Arizona would be foolish to trade out of number 4. And they've got a ton of EC, correct me if I'm wrong. Arizona's got a ton of draft picks this year, right?
Yeah, and they do. And I also think, I mean, Dave, if they can, they can also trade down. As I talked about, you get 2 picks from Minnesota, who now has 2 in the first round. And remember what Arizona did last year, and I'll reference this here in a little bit, is they traded down with Houston and then traded back up to take an offensive tackle in Paris Johnson Jr. So I could see them doing that again for another receiver if they agree with Proppy. If Monty Osenford, who's the GM, agrees with Proppy that maybe Harrison is not as clear-cut of a number 1 receiver as many think.
I think that would be very interesting. And the fact that Arizona's done that before seems like something that they could do again. And that would just kind of set off all the different domino effects that would take place with the bets. If you have Harrison going to Arizona, obviously that's one bet. Neighbors going to Arizona is another. But if you pick them to go 4th, 5th, or 6th, well, certainly 4th, if Arizona trades back with Minnesota, now they're going to have to do something to move back up to get one of those wide receivers. And we really didn't even talk about Rome Odunze. He's plus 3,000 to be the first receiver off the board. And he's no slouch either. He's practically as good as Harrison. I'm kind of curious to know where you guys have Odunze compared to Neighbors and Harrison. One sprinkle worthy, I like to talk in sprinkles. Taking plus 3,000 on Odunze being the first receiver off the board, I don't know if I really buy into it. But if a GM, if they've got the conviction that Odunze is the best receiver for them, they will take him. And at plus 3,000, 30 to 1, I think that that's actually worth one singular sprinkle. So I'll throw it to you, Alex. You just told us about Neighbors and why you love him. Do you love Odunze? Where do you see him going?
I like Odunze. I don't love Odunze. I think of the trio of wide receiver, he's the furthest away from realizing his potential. I think he's a bit more one-dimensional than the other two prospects as well. I personally have Odunze rated 4th on my big board. I have Brian Thomas Jr. as my 3rd rated wide receiver, teammate obviously of Malik Neighbors at LSU. But yeah, I think Odunze is somewhat of a polarizing prospect. He wins downfield. We see him on those go routes just dominant with Michael Penix Jr. I think that'll be a skill that could translate right away potentially. If Odunze hypothetically lasts until pick 10 to the Jets, I could see A-Rod, really working on just, keeping it simple for Odunze. Let's just work on, go routes, fade routes in the back of the end zone. But yeah, I just think when we're comparing him to these other two prospects, they're a lot more well-rounded, especially if we look at the versatility of something that Neighbors, who's capable of playing inside, outside, all three XYZ positions as well. Odunze needs more polish to his game. That being said, he has an incredibly intriguing skill set. He's a very extremely impressive athlete. I think there's a very good likelihood that a team like the Giants, if both these guys go 4th and 5th overall, which I think there's a pretty solid chance of that happening, the Giants could take Odunze as high as 6th overall. So I do think he'll ultimately be the 3rd wide receiver drafted of this trio. I personally have Thomas Jr. ahead of him on my own ratings, but I do think he will be selected within the top 8 picks.
Yeah, I like Odunze. I saw him in person when Washington played Arizona. He impresses me. I think Neighbors at 6 to the Giants seems like a pretty good bet. You can play that at plus 160 on FanDuel, where Giants first pick is Neighbors, or at number 6 first pick, who goes there. I think Neighbors is a pretty good bet to go right after Harrison, and I think the 4 quarterbacks also go in the top 5. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Odunze, I could see the Cardinals in that scenario that I mentioned earlier, trading back to, trading down, getting out of that spot, maybe picking up 2 first-rounders so that a team like Minnesota can trade up to get J.J. McCarthy. I can see the Cardinals trade up to number 8 with Atlanta, number 9 to Chicago to get Odunze as their number 1 receiver. So I think that one, to me, makes a ton of sense, and therefore that's what I'm going to go with there. Now, I don't know where you can bet that yet as we're doing that, because they only have the top 8 picks on the board, Dave. I don't really see – it's kind of weird that they don't have that flexibility with Chicago 9th. But I think as far as Odunze goes, I think Arizona will not be towards the top of the list as far as where will he end up once those odds are on the board. I think you can get some pretty good value if you believe that the Cardinals want to stockpile more draft picks in addition to what they already have.
And I think a team that needs to stockpile draft picks is Chicago. They've got 1. We think we know what they're going to do at 1. They've got 9th overall. They could get a really good player, obviously, and Odunze could be the guy that they end up picking, obviously a pass rusher as well. But after those 2 picks, the Bears have just 2 draft picks the rest of the way. No picks in rounds 5 through 7, by the way. That's a little strange. Usually you see teams with more draft picks than just 4. I could see Chicago being the team that trades down in round 1. And I think there's 2 teams that are absolutely desperate for wide receiver help. So if Odunze, or even if it's Neighbors or somehow Marvin Harrison Jr., it's not going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., but you know what I'm saying. If one of those receivers makes it to 9, I think you'll see Buffalo try and put together a big package to go get him, or Jacksonville. I think both of those 2 teams desperately need a wide receiver. So ultimately, I expect all 3 of these wide receivers to be top 9 picks. I'd be a little surprised if one of them went to the Giants at 6, but I would expect all 3 of them to be top 10 picks. There are some places where you can bet on whether or not a player will be top 10. Obviously, the odds are so steamed up for all 3 of these wide receivers. It's just not worth taking. But it does bring me to this prop. Over under on receivers taken in the first round. The number is 6.5. It's juiced to the over or the under rather, in a big way. I see the under at minus 165. It was actually lower than that earlier in the week. Alex, what do you think? Is there a way to go on this?
I think the number is efficient, Dave. From looking at this, I think there's really 4 guys, maybe 5 guys who are locked to go in the first round. Obviously, the aforementioned trio, Malik Neighbors, Harrison Odunze. I think Thomas Jr. is definitely going to be a first-round pick. I think Xavier Worthy, after the combine performance, cemented himself as a first-round pick as well. And then it's just finding 2 other wide receivers. Obviously, if we're talking over 6.5, Adonai Mitchell, I think, that's a good chance to go in the first round. Lad McConkey from Georgia as well, I would say. So yeah, I think there is a scenario where there are 7 wide receivers taken, because there's a lot of it's a top heavy, very strong class of wide receivers. Even after you get out of that trio, it's just a question of 7 is a large number, especially if we look across the board. How there's not really a defender projected to be in the top 8 or 7 picks. There's potentially 10 offensive linemen being drafted. Obviously, we have quarterbacks. So there are outcomes or potential scenarios where it does happen. I think the likelihood is probably close to a coin flip, or maybe a little bit less. So I lean under here. I think the odds are appropriate, considering just the bevy of talent at the position, as well as the talent at other positions who will be teams will be drafting, a lot of offensive linemen and cornerbacks late. And I think there's a lot of depth at those positions as well.
Proppy, let me ask you about this one, though. When it comes to, you've seen what the Packers have done, is I'm trying to point to the logo on my shirt, how they were able to take a guy in Christian Watson and Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks, these guys, 2nd, 3rd, 7th round picks. You don't have a first round pick on that roster as a wide receiver. So do you think that more teams, maybe Buffalo, for example, are looking at, hey, we just shipped out Stephon Diggs this week. Maybe we're going to go with a little bit of an unheralded group here, kind of like Green Bay did, because, hey, they got as far as Buffalo did in the NFC. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, Green Bay is an example of, a team that wasn't expected to have great results necessarily, snuck up on a lot of people. Yeah, they had some success in the playoffs. I don't think they necessarily bucked conventional wisdom and did something that other teams are suddenly going to be enamored by and all of a sudden shift their value. So I think teams still look at the wide receiver position as being very, very important. I think there's a high correlation between success and having talent at the wide receiver position. So if anything, I think they're more of an exception to the rule, Green Bay. And if this were something that had been a tried and true blueprint that we saw year after year after year, I'd say there was some credence to that. But just one season to me isn't enough data to really make a strong argument that particular strategy is one that could bear a lot of fruit, I guess.
All right, so that's fair. So Dave, here's what I'm thinking. I'm going Harrison and Odunze as my 2 receivers, obviously, and Neighbors and Thomas, the 2 LSU guys. So there's 4. And I think the 2 Texas guys of Worthy and Mitchell are your 6. And I think other teams will wait until the second round. And I think the second round will be plentiful for wide receivers off the board, at least 6, if not up to 7, maybe 8, if teams get carried away. So I'm playing that under, and I'm laying that juice. What do you think?
I'm with you on it. And I think I don't really love laying 165, but this is one that I actually feel pretty good about. First of all, talking about Green Bay and their approach to wide receivers, who was their quarterback for most of that time, EC? You know who it is.
Well, I mean, this past year, though, Dave, I mean, look what they did. They took 2 receivers last year in Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks, and they played significant roles this year.
They did. But before that, it was Aaron Rodgers. And the thought in their front office was, we don't need to get a premier wide receiver. We've got Aaron Rodgers, and he's a force multiplier, okay? When Aaron Rodgers is on the field, whoever he's throwing to theoretically should be better. Packers fans will disagree with that, thinking about guys like MVS and other players who used to catch passes from him and ended up flaming out and not being reliable enough for Aaron Rodgers. I think Buffalo is going to try and do the same thing unless they can get a deal that they think is fair to move up. And they also need to have a willing trade partner. So that's one issue. The other issue is we've heard so much about how deep this wide receiver draft class is, and I can verify it. It is super deep. And we've got 3 amazing wide receivers at the top. These guys are legit. I think Harrison, Neighbors, Odunze, they're studs. And I get where you're coming from on Brian Thomas. He's got that amazing size speed combo proppy. I think he's going to be a first-round pick too. I'm not sure there's another first-round pick here. So I hate the juice. I hate it being as high as it is, but I think under is the way to play it. Under 6.5 wide receivers going in the first round. Now, Alex, is there something you wanted to add?
Real quick, Uncle Dave, I would argue that while I do see there is, a strong likelihood of there being less than 7 wide receivers drafted in the first round, I would push back on Xavier Worthy. I really believe that when he ran that 40, there will be teams at the end of the first round, if he's available in that 25 to 30 range, a team like Kansas City, who obviously was lacking deep speed, they will fall in love with the tools that an Xavier Worthy adds. I would be shocked if he is not a first-round pick.
You can't teach speed. So let me give me yes or no answers to these, Properu. Adonai Mitchell, would you be surprised if he were not a first-rounder? Answer that question.
No.
Would you
would not be surprised?
Would you be surprised if Ladd McConkey was not a first-rounder?
Definitely would not be surprised.
Okay, is there any other wide receiver other than Worthy, Thomas, and the big three who you would be shocked, your jaws on the floor, if they weren't a first-rounder?
Absolutely not. I do think there is probably a strong likelihood that there are 5 gone. And only 5 in the first round.
My number is 5. Your number is 5. I'm not exactly sure what EC's number is. I'm not sure if you can count that high, but I do know that number 5 is under 6.5. Now, if you want to take that prop, where do you play it? It's simple. You go to BetMGM. New BetMGM customers can sign up today and get up to $1,500 in bonus bets. Just place your first wager of at least $10, and you will receive up to $1,500 instantly if your bet loses. You need a bonus code to make that happen. That bonus code is EDGE. That's EDGE, EDGE. That's what's happening at BetMGM. Now check out what else is happening.
Well, you need your sports news anywhere?
We've got breaking news to bring you.
Then get your sports anytime you want them. Big trade news overnight to discuss.
Because we know you need sports all the time.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
A legend adds to their legacy.
We're bringing you that breaking news right here on HQ.
CBS Sports HQ, anywhere, anytime, all the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Uncle Dave, and I am the advocate for the Early Edge NFL Draft Prop Show, where we will now speak about the reigning, defending, undisputed top tight end in the 2024 NFL Draft Class, Brock Bowers. It's WrestleMania weekend. Had to do it. Congratulations on the Hall of Fame, Mr. Heyman. Brock Bowers. If there's a top 3 among wide receivers, I think that the 4th name up isn't Brian Thomas. I think it's Bowers. I think he's an unbelievable size, speed prospect. Not a lot of downfield catches, but the ones he made were amazing. His ADOT was pretty low, and man, can he make some moves after the catch on those short throws. He's going to be a first-round pick. It's just a matter of which team he goes to. So which team do you like to draft Brock Bowers, and is there a corresponding bet that you would take? EC, you're on the clock.
All right. I love the intro for Brock Bowers, Dave. You're really excited about him. Hey, listen, from a fantasy perspective in dynasty leagues, excited about that proppy. I don't want to give you away my pick here in our league that we're in, but, Bowers is really intriguing. Nonetheless, here are the teams that I would look at for Bowers in the first round. The Jets at 10 obviously make a lot of sense, but I think they need an offensive tackle. The Colts at 15, I probably, other than Mo Alley Cox, I'm not really sure that I can name anyone else on the Colts roster as a tight end.
I can.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're the fantasy genius. I would expect you to name probably the whole depth chart.
Gotta show some love for Jelani Woods. That guy's a beast.
You could have given me 10 minutes. I wouldn't have come up with Jelani Woods.
I'm surprised you knew Mo Alley Cox.
Every now and then. The Seahawks at 16, Noah Fant's still there. I still remember last week I gave out Michael Penix at plus 600 to go there. So I'm going to stick by that. Cincinnati at 18 and Miami at 21. And I think the Dolphins, and I know we'll make our picks here shortly. That's a really interesting landing spot if Bowers falls that much, because Miami hasn't had a good tight end, Dave, since when? Proppy, am I wrong here? I know you have another thought on where Bowers could go, but the Dolphins never seem to have like a legitimate guy. Gesicki was good, but we're not talking like an elite tight end like a lot of teams have.
You're not sold on Durham Smythe, EC?
You could have given me 3 minutes and I wouldn't have gotten Durham Smythe either.
Someone's got to brush up on his tight end knowledge.
Sorry, I only stick to the top 20 in fantasy leagues, not below that.
Proppy, what do you think?
I agree with a lot of what you see. I mean, obviously, the Jets being a potential landing spot. Just looking at this roster, they're going for it, adding a guy like Mike Williams. You have Aaron Rodgers at the age that he is, coming off the injury. The Jets, the offensive linemen that they've had, they're not afraid to spend on veterans. Brock Bowers both fills an immediate need and also gives Aaron Rodgers another weapon. I think Brock Bowers is an exceptional prospect, and it can't be understated enough. Previously, tight ends really took a long time, or necessarily didn't really have big rookie seasons. But we saw what happened in Detroit last year with Sam Laporta. Tight end can certainly make a huge impact year one. So I think that has been proven. So, yeah, I could see Bauer stepping into the New York Jets right away, making a big impact, having a guy able to catch the ball over the middle of the field, in the middle of the seam. Bauer's ability to get open is very impressive. He's very polished for a prospect. So I love Brock Bowers. I think the Jets make a lot of sense. I do think if the Jets pass on him, he may end up falling a bit into the mid-teens, just looking at the teams available, what they're drafting, and their potential needs. And that's not necessarily a slight on Bowers. It's just you just don't see teams usually investing heavily in this position early in the first round, especially if they have defensive needs or offensive line needs. Tends to take priority there. So I think there's a chance that a team, potentially a dark horse, trades up for Brock Bowers. So I'm looking at the Jets, and then I think there's some good long shots that are worth speculating in a bit, Dave.
Well, let's call an audible and hear about those long shots, if you don't mind. But I do want to say the first thing I want to say is it used to be a thing in fantasy that you had to wait a year for your tight end to break out and be good. And then Kyle Pitts came along, and he only caught one touchdown, and it wasn't even in America. And what the hell is wrong with Arthur Smith and the Falcons? But he did have 1,000 yards as a rookie. Pat Freiermuth had a pretty decent rookie year. Then he fell off the map. Last year's crop was amazing. I think last year's crop kind of saved the tight end position in fantasy football. I think Bowers will add on to it. Absolutely see him as a dynamo in fantasy. Let's just go right to long shots. And Alex, talk about the ones that you really like, and then I'll tell you which ones I agree with or disagree with.
I have one in particular that I absolutely love, and it's my Philadelphia Eagles. I think this would be an on-brand move for them. First and foremost, if we look at the Eagles, they're not afraid to trade up. We've seen them do that in more drafts than they haven't done that. If they like someone or they believe there's value to be had, if a potential player has fallen, whether it be Jalen Carter, they will, in fact, spend the ammunition to then trade up. Again, this scenario would unfold if I think the Jets pass on Brock Bowers and he were to end up in that kind of 14 to 15 pick range. The Eagles also tend to really covet the tight end position. We've seen it historically when they had Brent Selleck. They spent a second-round pick on Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz, before he was even, I think, 31 or 30, they went out and got Dallas Goedert. So the Eagles tend to get a tight end and then draft his successor after his initial contract expires. So I really believe this would be on brand. Dallas Goedert is also not a spring chicken either. He is over 30 years old. So it wouldn't shock me whatsoever if he falls, if Brock Bowers falls past the Jets and he's available there at 13, pick 14, pick 15. If the Eagles really like him, I know they brought him in for a visit and then spent the draft capital to move up and took a player like Bowers, would really be a dynamic fit to the Eagles. Again, this is a long shot. This is something I believe at like 30-1 odds here. So not anything I'm making an official pick. I just think there's enough tea leaves there, and it would be on brand with the Eagles if the draft plays out a certain way.
Could be worth a sprinkle or two. At first, when you brought up Philadelphia, I thought to myself, no way. Like they have so many other needs. But then I heard what you had to say, and I don't disagree with it. And that look-ahead thing that you mentioned, every NFL team does that. If you pay attention to contracts, a lot of people don't, but I do. You kind of get a hint on what direction teams are going in, assuming that the front office feels like they're going to be there to be part of that direction. Some front offices, they know that it's a make or break year for them. They don't really give a darn about it. And then if you think about Philadelphia trying to come up with some short area targets, man, that's Brock Bowers to a T. That's exactly what he can do. And isn't it a thing where the Eagles draft Georgia players? Where did Brock Bowers go to school?
Good point.
That's interesting.
He be coming home.
Yeah, he's those Philadelphia Bulldogs. I've got some other long shots, but they're not like huge. They're not plus 30. They're not 30 to 1 plus 3,000, whatever the hell you want to call it. I like Indy at plus 400. I think Indy can sit right where they are, and Bowers can fall in their lap. Another big target for Anthony Richardson, and somebody that can work downfield or in the short area. Really a great fit for the RPO offense in Indianapolis. Cincinnati's another one, although I don't know if I'd invest that much in it, but Cincinnati, yeah, they've acquired tight ends. They've kind of flipped through them over the past few years. I think that this would be a way to kind of solve it and come up with the guy who could be their number 2 target getter once T. Higgins is pushed out the door. And that could happen as soon as this month. It could happen as soon as next February. We just don't know what's going to happen with T. Higgins there. And then the Chargers are an interesting one at plus 750. Picture this. The Chargers are the team that trades down to Minnesota's spot, perhaps. And Minnesota moves up. Bowers is somebody who was also recruited by Jim Harbaugh at Michigan. In fact, he took a visit there. And you know that Harbaugh loves those big, unique size characters. And this is somebody who's tough in Brock Bowers. He's played through some significant injuries, both in his high school and college career. I think that he would be somebody that Jim Harbaugh would love to get his cloppies on, someone that could mold into that offense, even though it's not the downfield threat that we would think of. And then one more, this is at 18 to 1, New Orleans. This is another team that I think just needs another target. And I know that Juwan Johnson finished the year nicely at tight end. Fantasy, Juwan Johnson's a little bit of a different cat than Brock Bowers, but I think Bowers could be a really good fit in New Orleans, and they're right in that same range as Indianapolis. You could even take all 4 of those teams. You'd break even if he goes to Indy. You'd make a little bit of money if he goes to Cincinnati or LA. You'd make a lot if he goes to New Orleans. EC, you've been sitting so nicely. You mentioned Miami as a team that needed a tight end. And when you brought that up, I thought to myself, yeah, Miami hasn't had a great tight end in a while. And why do they need one? But then I got to thinking about this. Mike McDaniels comes from San Francisco. Who's the tight end in San Francisco these days? And who does Brock Bowers tend to emulate? You tell me.
George Kittle, absolutely. And that's a great call there, Dave. I will say this. I really like your Chargers pick at plus 750. You know, in my scenario, I have Arizona trading out, this week. But if the Chargers were to trade down with Minnesota, because you assume that the Vikings would be the team, or maybe Denver trades up, they have a pick around 12, that if Bowers were to fall past 10, yeah, that makes a lot of sense for him to be drafted there. I'll give you that. At this point, I'm going to go with Cincinnati at, I think it's 18 would be my pick of where he would go. And I also think Miami at 21 at 40 to 1 plus 4,000. I mean, it's worth the sprinkle. If McDaniel wants to get that, you mentioned the Kittle connection there to give Tua some weapons. Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm good with that.
And they could always trade up to get him too. And if they ended up doing that, I think it'd be weird for Miami to go and get Bowers when they've got so many other needs and so many other concerns, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But if Mike McDaniel can't get him out of his mind as the next George Kittle, I could see Miami definitely trying to make a move for Brock Bowers, who I don't think will be a top 10 pick. And right now, you can get Bowers at plus 105 to be a top 10 pick. I asked you guys before the show if you thought that that's a bet worth taking. None of you said yes. We're moving on from that. But I do want you to put your odds maker's hat on. If a top 10 pick is not in the cards, where would you have the over-under on draft position for Brock Bowers? Alex, you can go first.
I honestly set it at 10.5. I think the first place he could conceivably go would be the Jets. Again, there's scenarios where I think, he could potentially crack the top 10. I think it's highly, highly unlikely. So yeah, I think that the first area that he has a high percentage to go would be the Jets. So I'd make the line 10.5.
Yeah, Proppy's a genius as per usual. 10.5 is a perfect line. Because listen, Atlanta already has Kyle Pitts. Chicago at 9 has Cole Kmet. And if they trade out, teams are either looking for a quarterback or a receiver in all likelihood. So I think the Brock Bowers draft starts at 10. I personally think the Jets will take an offensive lineman there and not take Bowers. So I'm playing the over if and when that line is ever released.
Hold that thought on the Jets and the offensive line. I would try and make it 13.5 to try to sucker people into taking the under, thinking that Brock Bowers is a top 10 type of pick. I think he's going to go 14th or later, might even fall as far as 18th. We talked about Cincinnati. I did. EC did. This isn't to say that Brock Bowers is a bad prospect. It's to say that there are other prospects that teams might need a little bit more, and they might view Bowers as more of a luxury item. And then one more thing on the Chargers. Yeah, LA's got 9 picks, but they just changed over their whole coaching staff. And I wonder if Jim Harbaugh would love to have more picks to play with. Trading down from 5, I think would be in play for LA. What do you say?
Dave, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Where from a fit perspective, from fantasy and just in general fit, what's the best fit for Brock Bowers in your opinion?
He needs to go to a team like Cincinnati where he won't be the number 1 target. The Jets, I guess, will qualify too, but only for a short period of time because I don't know how long Aaron Rodgers is going to play for. But you want him to play with a great quarterback where he won't be the number 1 option, but the number 2 option. The thing that kind of threw me off about Bowers was he didn't work downfield nearly as much. I kind of alluded to this. He didn't work downfield as much as I would have hoped for. A lot of screens, a lot of short throws. I wrote a draft profile on CBS Sports on Brock Bowers. You can read all about how many of his throws were short throws, inside of 5 yards, inside of 3 yards. Now, he did a lot of nice things with a lot of them. He can absolutely be a touchdown monster, but I don't know if he's a field stretcher. And that's something that a lot of the wide receivers in this draft can be. And it makes me a little bit nervous that Bowers will need volume. So as a fantasy analyst, I want to see him go to a team that's got a good quarterback and that'll prioritize him as the second best target in the offense. He also needs to go to a team that's got a good offensive line. And after the break, we're going to talk about offensive line props. Which teams could use some new help up front?
The blackout mystery remains.
Welcome to March Madness. Oh! You just never know in the tournament who is going to shine.
Stream March Madness live on any device, anywhere, and be ready for anything.
So this is going to be the part of the show where all the fantasy football heads kind of check out because they don't know about offensive linemen. They don't want to know about offensive linemen. But I would argue that there's a lot of money to be made on offensive line props in this draft. So pay attention if you like to increase what's inside your wallet from week to week. Joe Alt seems to be the consensus, maybe the Marvin Harrison of the offensive linemen. Would any of you guys bet against him being the first offensive lineman taken? EC, you're shaking your head no. Oh, look at Properoni. He's got that smirk on his face. All right. You see something. I don't know if I've ever been on a different level than you on a show before, Alex, but you see somebody other than Joe Alt as being the first offensive lineman off the board.
I want to first and foremost say that Joe Alt is the Malik Neighbors of offensive line prospects. Okay. So I took offense to that, Uncle Dave. But no, I do believe that Joe Alt is very likely going to be the first offensive lineman taken. However, this is an extremely deep class. I can't remember a time where we've seen the number set at 9.5 on potential offensive linemen taken in the first round. There are some exceptional prospects, not just at the tackle position, but at the guard and center as well. Obviously, Joe Alt being the first tackle off the board makes sense, but I do think there is a chance we see other guys, J.C. Latham, Fashanu from Penn State as well. Talise Fuaga, I think, has a chance. Again, slim, but I do think there is a scenario where when you have such tremendous depth, a lot of this has to do with scheme. You know, a team feels like they don't necessarily have the opening at left tackle, or they're looking for help on the right side of the line. One of these guys might make more sense to kick out to the right than Joe Alt maybe. So again, a lot of it has to do with how each individual team, you know, and what their needs are specifically on the offensive line, coupled with the scheme that they have. So I think there is a scenario where he's not, but again, he is the first rated prospect. And it does make sense for him to go. I could see him going. I know this is something we're going to touch on shortly, as high as 5th overall to Jim Harbaugh, who we know is building a team that starts in the trenches. So I do think Joe Alt is the number 1 prospect. Do I think there is a potential chance that other teams have Alt as not the top tackle on their board? I do.
I think that's interesting, but I think I'm also going to take that as a no. Because you didn't give me one name. Like, you had so much more conviction about Malik Neighbors than this one.
Yes. I don't feel like there's a go-to guy that's like clearly someone that teams are coveting over Joe Alt. I just feel that this is such a deep class, it wouldn't surprise me if some teams, just based on their needs, let's say Alt doesn't go 5th, the Chargers ended up going, let's say, with Malik Neighbors or Marvin Harrison, and we get down to that 7-8 range, and depending on the team and the scheme that they're running, I could see Alt not being an ideal fit for some of those teams.
Do you have a combo of maybe 2, 3, 4 linemen where I could bet them all and make a profit if one of them gets picked ahead of Alt?
Yeah, I'd say J.C. Latham from Alabama. I'd say Fashanu from Penn State, and the Oregon tackle as well, Talise Fulaga.
Okay. All right. I think that's fair. I think Alt's going to be the guy. I don't know if I would make it an official pick. I don't know if I've got that much confidence in it, and certainly the juice has to be explained, but I think Alt will be the first one. EC, do you have a feeling on this?
Oh, I have an official pick, Dave. I'm not afraid to make one on this show. Joe Alt's going number 7 to Tennessee. There is absolutely no reason for the Titans not to build around him in last year's first rounder, Peter Skoronski. So I'm going to lock Joe Alt in as the number 7 pick at -125 and find that on DK. I feel very confident in that. This is a team that already, they signed Calvin Ridley as a receiver. They signed Tony Pollard at running back to pair with Tyjae Spears. They're good there. You got to invest more on the offensive line. So Skoronski plus Alt is a very, very good young start. Inexpensive start. So I'm going to roll with that at -125. All right. So, Dave, which NFL teams do you think will take an offensive lineman with their first pick?
Oh, I think there's a ton of them, and I think Tennessee is one of them, but it's -500 to take that bet, and no thank you. I do not want to give the books -500, but I don't mind if the books give me +135, and that's what I see for the Jets taking an offensive lineman with their first pick. And this is why I couldn't buy into Brock Bowers being a top 10 pick. I took a look at that roster in New York. Teron Smith now being at left tackle for the New York Jets, formerly from Dallas. I think that's great, but he's 33 years old. He's in a contract year. Morgan Moses came over to the Jets from the Ravens. He's 33 years old. He's in a contract year. This is an example of a team looking ahead a year and finding somebody to replace a veteran. And I think this is what the Jets are going to do. And I'm sure they'd love to have Joe Alt, but they're going to settle for one of the guys that Prop named. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's Latham, Fashanu, any of those guys. And it doesn't matter which guy it is. I think the Jets are going to take an offensive lineman with their first pick. And at +135, dudes, I was tempted to make this an official pick. I'm going to wait a week. I want to see what happens to that line in the next week. But if we get to within 2 weeks, 10 days, 7 days of the draft, and it's still hovering right around here, I'm taking it. I've got conviction that the Jets are going to take an offensive lineman with their first pick. Alex, do you have a team that you like to take an offensive lineman first?
I think the Chargers are very much in the mix here. We know, again, I mentioned it earlier, but Jim Harbaugh, we know he likes to start, in the interior, in the trenches. And you have a prospect like Joe Alt, who looks to be, the consensus number 1 tackle prospect, and what is one of the deepest, most talented tackle classes I can remember. I think it makes a lot of sense if we look at the way that the Chargers have operated and maneuvered so far in the offseason as well. It looks to me that could be a potential fit. That would be the earliest I could see an offensive lineman go. I think it's worth a sprinkle there. I love your pick, and EC, I know, mentioned it as well, with the Jets in play. I think we'll see Tennessee, again, not necessarily the best odds there, but taking an offensive tackle makes a lot of sense for a lot of these teams. So, I think it wouldn't surprise me. Again, we're looking at potentially 10 offensive linemen being taken in the first round.
All right, so here are the teams that I would identify as taking in the first round an offensive lineman first. Tennessee, the Jets, as you guys have referenced. Denver, New Orleans, Cincinnati, if they don't take Bowers.
Denver is interesting.
Yeah, Denver. I mean, they got to do something on that offensive line.
All right, let's talk about that one next week. But keep going with your list. I'm sorry.
All right, but so we got Denver there. New Orleans, I know you referenced them as another Bowers one. Same with Cincinnati. Pittsburgh, we haven't talked about them, but they definitely need some offensive line help. Miami, if Bowers has gone there, they could help Tua out. Dallas has lost a lot on the offensive line. Baltimore, San Francisco, Kansas City in the first round. That's 10 teams, and you got to figure that Bowers goes to one of those teams. So I'm going under the 9.5 offensive linemen. If you're looking at second-round teams, Cleveland and Houston, also playoff teams that could use some more offensive line help. I think a lot of these teams that made the playoffs last year, you want to stabilize that offensive line to have more depth. I think Philly's another one, Proppy. I mean, I think that's another one that could make a lot of sense. So you going over or under? So you're taking over the 9.5, probably.
I'm taking the over 9.5. I did want to add, I think the Eagles are certainly in play to take an offensive lineman. I think if they stand pat, the strongest likelihood is between a defensive back and an offensive lineman. I'd have a slight lean to the offensive line if the Eagles, in fact, don't end up trading up or down in this. So I think the Eagles are very likely to invest in the offensive line here.
Dave, where do you stand with that?
I wouldn't be surprised if Philadelphia invested in the offensive line. I feel like they've got a bunch of other needs too, like cornerback. Are they really going to go into the season with James Bradbury as a starter again? Could they find somebody to take Bradbury's spot a year from now, or maybe by week 3? We don't know how that's going to go. So I think that they've got some interesting choices to make. And, that kind of stinks for the Bowers argument that we had so much fun talking about earlier, but that's just kind of how it goes. And of the teams you mentioned, EC, the only one that has plus odds, and they're pretty good plus odds to take an offensive lineman with their first pick, is Kansas City at plus 230. Can you even name their left tackle right now, EC?
I can't even name tight ends. You think I'm going to go for left tackles?
I shouldn't have asked you. It's Wanya Morris. I know that prop.
No chance. Zero.
Sure. And then a couple of other teams that you mentioned that have low odds. Miami is at minus 150. I actually think that that's not bad considering their offensive line situation. They need somebody to be ready to go if Teron Armstead doesn't play. And I think you said Baltimore. They're at minus 200. Yeah. That's not so great. Dallas at minus 170. That's also maybe not so great. I like the under. I like the plus odds. I do think that there is a path for 10 offensive linemen to be taken in the first 32 picks. But I think that that's a position that's deep, and teams are going to say, we can wait around and find somebody else. And so I will take that under. And
Dave, I'm gonna tell you, there's a guy that's a key to this, to the over under in this bet.
Okay.
My guy from the University of Arizona, my alma mater, Jordan Morgan, is a swing guy that is a left tackle, but he's a guy that's on the first, second round border. And I honestly think there will be 9 offensive linemen taken. And I think if a team like Baltimore, Kansas City, or San Francisco late were to take Morgan, there's your 10 and there's your over. And if not, he goes into the second round and that under plus 110 hits. So that, just keeping an eye on that. Jordan Morgan, if he goes in the first, the over's hitting.
I think we're 2 for 2 on NFL draft prop preview shows that Jordan Morgan's name has come up.
We're going to go 5 for 5, 6 for 6. Let's do it.
The odds on that are minus 5,000. All right. Enough about this offensive line talk. Let's bring in the fantasy managers that wanted to take a mental break. Let's talk about defense, because defense matters. If you don't pay attention to defense in fantasy, you're not going to win in your fantasy leagues. It's all about the matchups. And the first defender taken, Dallas Turner, the Alabama edge rusher, he's the favorite. He's the betting favorite. But I wonder if there's a case to be made for other players to be taken ahead of Dallas Turner. EC, do you see it that way?
No, I think you got to go with the best player here. And I think Dallas Turner at number 8 for Atlanta is plus 130. I think there's good odds there. Listen, the only reason I'm not locking it in is if they were to trade the pick to a quarterback or wide receiver needy team, like we talked about Arizona earlier, if they were to trade down and then trade back up. But at this point, I cannot. I was going down the defensive list of players. I cannot find anyone, including Jared Verse or the cornerback Mitchell from Toledo. Like, there's nobody that I'm taking. This is Alabama, an edge rusher from Alabama. We've seen that there is a track record of success from Alabama players, Proppy. You cannot pass on a guy from Alabama who's a stud for a guy from Toledo. It's just, it's like you're a GM. If you want to get fired, that's how you do it.
Again, I think we're looking at this objectively. There are scenarios where I think Atlanta does, in fact, take Jalen Turner, but I do think there's some, again, scenarios where Atlanta looks to go in a different direction. And I think Byron Murphy Jr. Has a strong likelihood of being a top 10 pick. I could see him going to Atlanta potentially as a surprise pick. I think when you have this strong conviction or this consensus where one player makes so much sense for a team, often it goes a completely different direction. So I look at Byron Murphy Jr. He has an incredibly rare skill set, the ability to collapse the pocket from the interior, almost like in the mold of Aaron Donald. That is something incredibly valuable that I think almost any defensive team or any team, even teams that are stacked on defense, can use a guy that can bring heat on the quarterback from the interior. A team like Chicago makes a lot of sense for me for Byron Murphy. If they stand pat at 9, let's say Atlanta goes in a different direction, trades out of the pick. So I think a guy like that could potentially be the first defensive player drafted. He has a unique skill set. So I agree, if we're comparing Turner to maybe a guy like Jared Verse, Turner looks to be the number 1 edge defender, but there are no other players, in my opinion, that offer the skill set of a Byron Murphy Jr. in this draft class. So I could definitely see him potentially as the first defensive player selected.
We already have talked about how there's so many wide receivers in the draft and offensive linemen in the draft. And there's some decent to good edge rushers behind Turner and Verse in the draft. There are not a lot of those big down and dirty defensive tackles like Murphy. So I kind of like what you're selling there. I think that's a decent long shot bet. I've got another one. And to make it better, it's somebody from Alabama. And it's at cornerback. Terrion Arnold is plus 1,800, 18-1 to be the first defensive player off the board. He's fast, he's strong, he's savvy. He actually makes plays in the backfield, or at least he did at Alabama. I think he could do it in the NFL too. And he doesn't have the size nor quite the speed of Quinyon Mitchell, but he's got the experience. He's got the pedigree from Alabama. And I love those odds. I think that's sprinkle worthy. 18-1 on Arnold to be the first defensive player taken off the board. And you know that if we talk about cornerbacks and which cornerback is first off the board, well, I'd be an idiot to tell you that Quinyon Mitchell would be my pick. I'd go with Arnold there too. The odds aren't anywhere near as attractive at plus 190, but I'm going to be close to locking that one in too in the weeks ahead. If we're like right up against the draft and the top cornerback prop is going to be Mitchell as the favorite, and then Arnold right behind him at plus 190, maybe even plus 170. I think I'm going to hammer that. I think he could end up being the better pro than Quinyon Mitchell could be. What do you think of that one, Alex? And do you have a favorite at cornerback, first cornerback to be taken off the board?
I think the cornerback is a fascinating position in this draft because there's not really a clear-cut number 1 overall guy. I definitely think both guys you mentioned could certainly be taken as the first corner. I also look at it like usually the majority of mocks we're looking at, we see a lot of corners going in the teen range, and then like 5 or 6 come off the board between pick 15 and pick 25. So I really think there's just a wide range of outcomes when evaluating these corners. A guy like Kool-Aid McKinstry could potentially, some teams could have him as their number 1 corner. Again, it really comes down to scheme. What type of versatility, the needs. Are they looking for guys that can play all over the defense, hybrid type role? Are we looking for a more conventional shutdown corner? So, yeah, I really think it comes down to the potential team needs, what their defensive scheme looks like. And, yeah, I think this would be a position that I would potentially look at some long shots just because I do think there's a wide range of outcomes because there's no consensus number 1 corner here. Although, again, I would lean on it being between Quinyon as the likeliest number 1 corner of the class.
Yeah, the betting favorite. Sure. We should talk about sleepers and long shots next week. Let's agree to that right now. Let's lock into that on next week's NFL Draft Prop Show. Sleepers, long shots, whatever you want to call them. We will talk about that. I'll bring up Arnold at 18-1 as the first offensive player off the board there. And so you kind of talked about this, Alex, and EC, I'll ask you about this. The teams that could take a cornerback with their first pick. Which teams do you see, EC?
Yeah, it's always interesting when you look at teams that take corners in the first round because some of them are really, really good and some of them stink. I mean, you talk about getting a GM fired. This is how to do it when you take a corner in the first round and the guy's not very good. All right, so here's some teams that I'm looking at. Las Vegas at 13, Indianapolis at 15, Jacksonville 17, Philly. I mean, you mentioned them earlier, Dave, at 22. Detroit at 29, they could use that help. No adventurous draft for the Lions this time, taking running backs and tight ends and linebacker. Who knows what they're going to – they had a great draft last year. I think they need a corner. And then San Francisco at 31 could definitely use some help. So those are 7 teams that I would look at that I'd be pretty confident would take a cornerback earlier than later.
Alex, is there a team there that you like?
Yeah, if I were to pinpoint one in particular that I'd be, again, a lot changes. This is a fluid process when it comes to selecting positions for teams. I personally choose to wait closer to the draft, but Jacksonville makes a ton of sense. I know EC mentioned them as a landing spot for corner. Just looking at their team, their roster construction, how they value the position, the players who will be available when Jacksonville selects as well. That's when you really start seeing the top corners going off of the board. So that looks like a potential landing spot because it's need that meets fit. So yeah, everything kind of lines up, in my opinion, for Jacksonville to take a corner.
And don't they need help back there with Stephon Diggs now coming into their division, and Michael Pittman is in their division, and Calvin Ridley, by the way, who was on their team, now he's on a different team in their division. Makes a lot of sense if Jacksonville can't trade up to get one of the top 3 receivers, that they just stay put and take one of the top corners. And that's along that same line of thinking that I like Las Vegas. And the odds aren't great. It's plus 175. At least it's plus odds to take a cornerback. But I could see them. They've got a couple of good veterans. They've got Jones. They've got Hobbs. They need one more. And they need somebody that can help take away half the field in man coverage against Patrick Mahomes and a Chiefs offense that added Marquise Brown. I wonder if there's a cornerback that's out there that could do that. Could his name be, I don't know, Terrion Arnold? Going to Las Vegas, play that physical style, bring that experience from Alabama to Raider Nation. I kind of like that fit. Let's circle back around to the defensive line, the edge class. Which teams could take a defensive line and an edge with their first pick? Eric, you've been so good at listing off the teams that could take a defensive line or any player at any position first. Do it for us now with defensive linemen and edge players.
Oh, I'm telling you what, Dave, there is nothing like when your team in the first round takes a defensive lineman. You're like, ugh. I mean, as a Packer fan, it gets frustrating every year. Last year, they took Lucas Van Ness, who didn't even start at Iowa. You know, you get excited. You want skill position players. You want guys you're going to talk about fantasy football. You want guys you're going to see it. And then you take a defensive lineman who you never saw play at Iowa. Hey, it's not bad. I guess, I mean, Rashawn Gary turned out well for them, but here are a couple teams that I'm looking at, or more than a couple teams. I got 7 teams I'm identifying here. Atlanta, we talked about. Dallas Turner, there's one at 8. Seattle at 16. If they pass on Penix, they don't want to take a tight end. That's a good spot for one. Jacksonville, Proppy talked about them for a corner, but if they were not to go corner and wait on that, the team that I really think of all this entire list that I am most confident about is the Rams at 19. No more Aaron Donald. They need to get something. I could see them trading up if there's somebody they really like. Maybe a Byron Murphy is somebody that they like and they can move up for. Of course, Green Bay at 25 because that's what they do. And then Tampa Bay at 26, they could probably use some help there. So that's just a list of teams that are going to draft somebody who's not that exciting, and we're not going to talk about it because it's not a fantasy guy. It's not a skill position player. Those guys are really helpful. As you mentioned, Dave, when it comes to defenses, not a bad trait to have is to have a strong defensive line.
Sure. I just want to point out that edge rushers are included in the defensive linemen. So it's not just guys like Byron Murphy, who you, Proper Roo, mentioned earlier in the show, but also Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, those types of guys. And they are exciting players. Fans are excited about defensive players.
Are they,
Maybe
though?
Fantasy managers shouldn't be.
Yeah, who said, oh, my team took Jared Verse. Whoop-de. I mean, if the Eagles took Jared Verse, Proppy's not going, oh, my gosh, the Eagles are winning a Super Bowl.
It's more exciting than an offensive lineman.
That's
true. My
That's
team
not
took a
saying
guard
much.
in round 1. That's
Fair.
not as much fun.
Or an off-ball traditional linebacker.
That's true as well.
I would much rather have a defensive, like an interior presence.
Hell,
I was ecstatic at Jalen Carter being drafted by the Eagles last year.
yeah, I don't blame you.
But he was also a guy that was they were talking about going number 1 overall to Chicago. Last year they trade the pick and then he drops to 9 because he had some off the field issues. So I get that problem.
I think we can all think back to, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 2014, when the Los Angeles Rams, or I think they were the St. Louis Rams at the time, took a little known player out of the University of Pittsburgh named Aaron Donald, who I think all of those fans are maybe at the time didn't have a lot to say or weren't incredibly enthusiastic about the pick. But 10 years later and a first ballot Hall of Fame career later, arguably the best defensive player of his generation, I think there's certainly think that was a savvy pick.
All right, we got to get moving. Proppy, do you have a team that you think will take a defensive lineman or edge with their first pick?
I think Chicago is a very strong likelihood. I mentioned them as a landing spot for Byron Murphy Jr.
Hold on. With their first pick.
Excuse me, with their first pick. Okay, no, obviously I don't expect them to go first overall. With their first pick, I think Atlanta makes a lot of sense with Raheem Morris. Also looking at the defensive depth there on the line, I could see obviously again Turner, one of the more popular picks we see in mock drafts is Jalen Turner going to Atlanta. So I do think there's a lot of smoke there. Necessarily, I don't know if it's definitely going to be Jalen Turner, but I think it's a very strong likelihood we see Atlanta address their defensive line with their first pick.
Yeah, I think Dallas Turner would make sense. If I told you the line was minus 190, would you take that, or is that too steep?
No, too steep.
Okay, I've seen it at minus 190. Let's shop around and see if Atlanta we can find that. What would you take it at? Minus 130?
I'd look for even. I think when we're looking at the number 8th overall pick, when there's no guarantee that that Dallas Turner is the first defensive player on their draft board, I'd have to get better than plus odds to feel comfortable taking that. Just because a consensus mock draft has a player being slotted there, I've seen enough drafts to know that the actual evaluators and decision makers couldn't be further from what their boards look like.
Right, exactly, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and they're the beholders, not the people that are doing the mock drafts, says the guy who's going to do a mock draft before the NFL draft. 2 teams, real quick. I think both of these teams are in play to take a defensive lineman. We've talked about both of them already. Tampa Bay, plus money, plus 185. They lost Shaq Barrett. They're not getting what they want out of Joe Tryon. I think that they could add another rusher there. I don't think it'll be a defensive tackle. I think it'll be an edge rusher, and getting almost 2-1. I really like that one. And Cincinnati is the other one. And yeah, we've talked about Cincinnati and getting Brock Bowers. Honestly, candidly, this is the direction that I think that we're going to see Cincinnati go in. Hold on a sec, Alex. Plus 400. They've got 2 great pass rushers right now, Trey Hendrickson, Sam Hubbard. They could move on from both of them after this season. So 4-1 for Cincinnati to get somebody on that front line on defense. I like it a lot. Proppy, go.
Dave, I know you thought we didn't align with a lot of things, but I think those were such great selections. One thing I think we can identify and look at is the historic trends of these teams. We know Tampa Bay and Cincinnati invest heavily in the defensive line with their early round picks. That's something we see them do on a year in and year out basis. Philadelphia Eagles are similar in that sense as well. These teams like to invest in their line play. So I think Tampa Bay and Cincinnati are excellent picks because we know they're capable and willing to spend first round picks on the position.
You want to know why teams do that? They're safe. They're not sexy picks, EC.
They don't
Sorry
bust.
that you're not electrified.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, listen, Dave, if you're as a Green Bay fan, when you want Aaron Rodgers at the time to get help in wide receivers, and you have guys like Michael Pittman that are on the board, and then Green Bay takes, they took Jordan Love in that game.
Now we're airing grievances.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. Go ahead, Proppy.
When Derek Brown is getting a $96 million contract, 8 career sacks, and he's getting a $96 million 4-year deal from Carolina, it shows that this position, like Dave mentioned, there's not a lot of busts with this position. It's very safe. And these guys tend to produce on the field, even if they aren't necessarily the sexy picks or the big home run picks.
Sure. And there's Saints fans right now that are cursing us out because they've taken Trevor Penning to be their left tackle of the future, and he hasn't worked out. Trevor Penning. Man, look him up, man. My goodness. It's crazy. You don't know everything. All right. But you do know Joe Alt's name, EC. And that's your one lock today. And good for you for putting some stones up. You now have 3 locks on the NFL draft. One last time, 30 seconds, Joe Alt. Why is he your favorite to go at 7th overall?
I'll tell you what, Dave, you put him with Peter Skoronski, number 7, with the number 7 pick here. Tennessee has themselves a nice young offensive line, 2 top 10 picks, with a strong running attack is what they've been prioritizing. New head coach Brian Callahan. I really like Alt and Skoronski to form that basis of a strong offensive line for Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears. Lock that in at minus 125.
Alex. You
It's
haven't
almost
locked in anything yet. And I know that you're being smart about it. You want to let the market kind of settle a little bit as we lead up to the draft. I don't know if the market will actually ever settle on draft picks. You were so confident on Neighbors. There isn't anything that you want to lock into at this point.
There will be that you can take this to the bank, Dave. That is a lock that I will have some locks on our next episode next Friday. But I will lock in Neighbors as the first wide receiver taken off the board. I believe that's a 3-1 odds. I will lock that in as an official pick of mine.
We did it. We got him to lock something in. So now on the scoreboard, Properou's got one. I've got one. EC's got 3. That's 5 picks for everybody to go and hammer right now. The Neighbors call. Bold. Especially at 3-1. Hey, plus odds or plus odds. You'll take it. 3-1. 3. Less than 3 weeks. 3 of us here, but less than 3 weeks until the NFL draft. 3 more Fridays. And yeah, that includes the Friday after round 1. We'll be back here. Of course, we'll be here before round 1 on Wednesday before the NFL draft to help you profit from the 2024 NFL draft. Just 3 guys. Well, 2 of them know the players in the league. One of them's got to do a little bit of homework on the other tight ends that aren't elite and maybe some defensive linemen, but he's going to work on it. He's also got the guts to put his neck out there on 3 picks already. So props to you, EC. Props to you, Alex, for coming through. Props to me for hosting a show about props. We'll see you next week.